This is the Great Vocal Majority Podcast. Hey everybody, it's Tony Codispati, and this is the Great Vocal Majority Podcast, Volume 46, and the third in my short series, and third installment of the evolution of the American counter-revolution. And in this one, it'll be a little longer than the other ones. This starts off with the battle of ideas from FDR to LBJ to Reagan. Now, the debate between the left and the right has often been called the battle of ideas. For progressives, the pinnacle of their power was reached when President Lyndon Johnson enacted the Great Society and War on Poverty programs of the early 1960s. You see, Johnson saw himself as a progressive in the mold of FDR. And FDR is the man who guided the United States through the deprivations of the Great Depression, using a series of interventionist policies, most of which proved to be largely ineffective. But they were great public relations for activist and interventionist government. It gave the public the impression that their elected leaders were making every effort to alleviate their suffering. But how well those programs were working was almost besides the point, and without having a better idea, the Republicans were lost. The Republicans were seen as anachronistic and almost brutish. The left rejoiced when Johnson declared the war on poverty. Their ideas finally would be put to the test, and all the world would be able to witness the results. This form of activism had many political advantages, not the least of which was one that the founders warned as a signal of the end of the republic itself. It was Benjamin Franklin who was thought to have said, quote, "When the people find that they can vote themselves money out of the treasury, that will herald the end of the republic," unquote. The political advantage to this is that it allows politicians to demonize anyone opposing these policies that are supposedly there to help people. During the intervening half-century, politicians did just that. Faced with program cost overruns, corruption, and abuses of all kinds, the left progressives defended against any attempt at reform and improvement of these programs. But they didn't defend against, or they actually promoted, the expansion of these programs, even though they were just wasting oodles of money. Nevertheless, the programs were failing to achieve the desired results. Even the dire predictions of the inevitable moral hazards posed by these programs from progressives were shouted down. Perhaps the most famous of these were the warnings of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who saw liberalization of welfare assistance as deleterious to the health of the nuclear family. Moynihan reasoned that if welfare allowances were increased with the number of children in a home without a male, father figure, or a breadwinner of any kind, then the family unit would be destabilized. Financial benefits would be greater to a home without a father present, and fathers would be driven out of the home in order to gain a greater benefit. This is what we mean when we use the term moral hazard. A moral hazard is when a law creates a perverse incentive. Obviously, creating financial incentives which unintentionally drive fathers out of homes is not what the creators of these welfare programs wanted. At least we don't think it is. But that's what they got. Moynihan was ridiculed for predicting this result, which he believed would affect the black family to a much greater degree, simply because blacks were disproportionately poorer than whites and therefore more likely to be eligible for the program benefits. The last half-century of experience with these programs has proven Moynihan to be correct. Certainly there are many factors affecting fatherlessness, but the impact of perverse incentives on low-income and poor black families cannot be overestimated. This is just one example, but there are many others which reflect how the ideas of the left have failed with disastrous consequences for the country. By the end of the 1970s, America was ready for a change, and they got it with the election of Ronald Reagan. President Reagan was the most conservative president since Calvin Coolidge. He entered office after a period marked by generations of progressive presidents. Hoover, FDR, Truman, JFK, LBJ, and Nixon would all identify themselves as either a left or a right progressive. Harding, Coolidge, Eisenhower, they weren't progressives. Reagan entered office standing against decades of progressive history with the task of undoing its damage. Consider the daunting task it was. Reagan put a significant dent in the progressives' momentum. The fantastic success of his economic policies was astonishing. Though today's progressives will level criticism at Reagan's economic performance, it's hard to argue with the results. Ronald Reagan gave us almost 25 years of uninterrupted economic growth and near full employment. The success of the Reagan presidency marked the first time progressives suffered a major repudiation of their policies through the successful implementation of conservative public policy. At its core, Reagan's economic policy employed so-called supply-side economic theory. At risk of oversimplification, I'll explain what that is. The theory treated macroeconomic inputs of labor and capital as responsive to changes in their prices. Therefore, as the theory goes, if public policy could lower the price of both labor and capital, we should witness greater demand for both. Through lowering marginal tax rates on labor and capital, coupled with regulatory reform, the cost of both would be reduced. Now, Reagan wasn't talking about reducing wages. He was talking about reducing the cost of labor, which has many facets. So, by doing that, he would increase demand for labor, and that would mean more jobs. Increased demand for capital would mean more investment. The two combined together would create economic growth. In short, supply-side economics worked. Progressives have been touting the Keynesian economic model since the Great Depression. The efficacy of the Keynesian model was doubted even by FDR's Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau. The Keynesian model targets demand for goods and services in the aggregate. It relies on government spending in deficit, in other words, borrowing. Essentially, the theory states that a dollar spent by the government trickles its way down through the economy in such a manner that it creates more than a dollar of economic activity. The difference over the amount originally spent by the government is called the multiplier effect. The only trouble is the Keynesian model does not appear to work, or at best is of very limited economic utility, but a very great political utility. In 1939, the aforementioned Henry Morgenthau, in company of Democrats from the House of Ways and Means Committee, made the following statement, and this is a quote: "We have tried spending money. We are spending money more than we ever spent before, and it does not work. And I have just one interest, and if I am wrong, somebody else can have my job. I want to see this country prosperous. I want to see the people get a job. I want to see people get enough to eat. We have never made good on our promises. I say after 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as we started with, an enormous debt to boot," unquote. Now that could be said about the Obama administration. More than anyone else, Henry Morgenthau was the man most responsible for the Keynesian policies that funded the New Deal. Despite all of its shortcomings, politicians on both sides of the aisle embraced Keynesianism. Keynesianism involves Congress appropriating and spending money targeted toward programs designed to address problems of some kind, whether they're social or economic. Often, what happens is, even when the efficacy of government program is dubious, spending has a greater political benefit than not spending. When progress towards solving problems is not likely to be had, a politician will settle for the next best thing, which is the optics of appearing to be doing something constructive. It is in this way that government spending becomes a crutch for the politician or an addiction for both the politician and the constituent. In the absence of a better answer, spending on poorly designed and ineffective government programs became deeply entrenched in our government structure and body politic. So here comes Ronald Reagan, and there finally seems to be an answer coming from the right, an answer that not only worked, but seemed to be popular. In his bid for re-election in 1984, Ronald Reagan won a 49-state landslide. But Reagan's success was limited to macroeconomic policy. He did very little, really, to reform the progressive welfare state and its mentality of government dependency. That, however, came 6 years after Reagan left office. Now, this next section I'm going to call the Reagan victory in the Battle of Ideas, and that happened in 1994. In 1994, with a newly minted Democrat president in the White House, Bill Clinton, the midterm elections witnessed an historic event. The Republican Party won a majority in the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years. Led by Newt Gingrich, a Republican and a right progressive, in the mold of a Theodore Roosevelt, Gingrich proposed a contract with America. This was the conservatives' response to those many consecutive decades of dysfunctional left progressive programs that were rotting due to poor design and moral hazard. After several attempts, the contract with America was signed into law by Bill Clinton. Welfare rolls and government dependency was cut in half. People formerly on the government dole were employed and self-sufficient. Not everyone celebrated the success of the contract with America. Its success revealed just how deeply entrenched the welfare statists had become. When governments establish bureaucracies and the programs associated with those bureaucracies and programs develop constituents. When those bureaucracies and programs are aimed at solving a social ill like poverty, a counterintuitive dynamic can result. And what do I mean by that? Well, if the problem is solved, there would be no need for the program or the bureau. Now, this runs counter to the way people think and behave. A bureau created to address poverty will cultivate a constituency comprised of the poor. How would such a bureau measure its success? Would it measure it by the number of people it could find who are eligible for the program? Or would it measure success by how many people it lifted out of poverty, away from government dependency, and towards self-sufficiency? Experience has shown us that bureaucracies behave much like people do and strive for self-preservation at a minimum. So it's not surprising that since bureaucracies are comprised of people, they behave in the same way. This presents us with a gigantic problem. From the early 20th century until the present day, the federal government has been shaped by a permanent bureaucracy, largely put in place by left progressives to address certain domestic, economic, and social problems. Over several generations, those programs and bureaus have created an entrenched constituency, invested in the perpetuation and propagation of the social problems as much or more than their resolution. Now, this contradiction and its side effects are exacerbated by poorly designed programs which fail to achieve their goals and often create permanent dependent constituents. If this were the only problem, America would still have its hands full. Ronald Reagan's presidency and later the contract with America have cut a clear pathway toward correcting the problem, though. That's the good news. The challenge is not only in government itself. Tens of millions of Americans have been raised on the notion that government will be their caretaker, and they have been taught to feel entitled to that care. The contract with America began to reverse that thinking until 2006, when the Democrats retook the House and Senate and worked quickly to undo all those reforms. The battle of ideas ended with the consecutive successes of the Reagan economic policy and the contract with America. From that moment forward, in the late 1990s, the political atmosphere in America turned toxic. Americans noticed its toxicity, but seemed less observant as to its proximate cause, focusing on personalities of political leaders and less on policy. Most of the public failed to notice something a few political observers couldn't miss. Conservative solutions worked far better than progressive ones. As the 20th century came to a close, the progressive left hardly felt the need to panic. Clinton was a successful two-term president, even though his administration was plagued by scandal. The economy prospered greatly while he was president, owing to much of its good fortune to the continuation of Reagan-era economic policy. For one, the peace dividend resulting from the fall of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European Communist bloc, and the advent of the Internet. With the 2000 presidential election just over the horizon, and Vice President Al Gore the heir apparent to Clinton, the progressive left was unconcerned that their dominance of the American political landscape would be challenged, but it didn't really work out that way. And so now we're going to talk about how that great divide between the left and the right happened, and how the left reemerged. The 2000 presidential race is going to go down in history as the closest race ever. George W. Bush defeated Al Gore by acquiring just one more electoral vote than he needed to win. The controversy was made even greater by the fact that Bush's brother was governor of the state of Florida, where a recount dragged on for weeks that decided the election. The Supreme Court actually decided it by stopping the recount when Bush had approximately 500 votes more than Gore in Florida. It was a very bitter pill for Democrats to swallow. In politics, grudges can last a very long time, and the 2000 race was no exception. Today, 17 years later, many Democrats still believe Bush was not legitimately elected president. The division resulting from the 2000 race had a wider impact than it would ordinarily have, for reasons soon to be described here. Inasmuch as Bush was thought to have been fraudulently elected, everything Bush did while president was also thought to be fraudulent as well. 8 months into his presidency, the 9/11 attacks and the national response to it brought Americans together, but just briefly. That unity was shattered after the United States failed to find an active WMD program in Iraq. Democrats, sensing weakness, accused the president of lying in order to draw the country into a war in Iraq, an extremely serious charge. Such a thing, if true, is traitorous. Although the charge whipped up many Democrat supporters into a frothy frenzy, they weren't serious. The Democrats just weren't serious. And how do we know that? Because in 2006, after the Democrats took back control of both the House and the Senate from the Republicans, they never took a single step toward impeaching President Bush. It's difficult to imagine why they wouldn't have tried to impeach him if those accusations they were making were true. After all, they were saying the president was a traitor. The issue of Iraq WMDs served to radicalize the Democrat Party from a left-leaning party comprised of a mix of moderates, of so-called blue dog Democrats, liberals, and left progressives. By the 2006 midterm elections, the party was firmly in control of its most extreme elements. Even the Democrats' 2000 vice presidential nominee, Joe Lieberman, was considered too conservative for their party and was banished from it. Less than a handful of years earlier, Democrats thought Lieberman was good enough to be a president if anything untoward were to happen to Al Gore. When the 2008 election cycle was in full swing, Americans wanted a change. More than change of party, Americans were restless and wanted more drastic change. The Democrats were primed to nominate a full-blown leftist progressive. Both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama met that requirement, but Obama met it more than Clinton and was a fresh face, whereas Clinton was a well-known quantity. Obama defeated Clinton and won the presidency easily over the aging and sclerotic John McCain. When Obama assumed the presidency in 2009, the economy was reeling. Hemorrhaging jobs and contraction of the GDP in the most recent quarter was greater than it had been in decades. In that crisis, the president was given great leeway to boost the economy. But Obama was hardly an experienced veteran in national politics, or for that matter, macroeconomic theory. If anything, Obama was a street organizing academic from Chicago. That's where he had most of his experience, and that's the experience and background he brought to the White House and relied upon. The key members of Obama's cabinet and a plethora of economic advisors were all out of the academic world, and few, if any, had any business experience upon which to rely. It was a recipe waiting to become an unmitigated disaster. All the components for catastrophic policy failure were present. We had an inexperienced leftist ideologue in the presidency, a team of advisors who were mostly inexperienced leftist ideologues as well. All of them were wedded to the failed notion of Keynesian economic solutions. All of them were true believers in the cause of left progressivism, and we had a country deep in crisis. Within the first month of being in office, President Obama passed a stimulus package without a single Republican vote. He could do that because the Democrats controlled the House with a comfortable margin, and the Democrats had a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. The stimulus package cost more in a single year than both the war in Iraq and Afghanistan had cost from the day those two conflicts began until 2009. This enormous expenditure was supposed to stimulate the economy, as does spending dollars trickle down, as I mentioned earlier, and robust growth was supposed to be the result, generating millions of jobs. And it didn't happen. Compounding injury upon insult, a large portion of the stimulus package's appropriations became part of the baseline budget for the agencies receiving the funding. This meant that a large share of the stimulus money would be spent out of federal agencies year after year after year unless Congress passed a new budget. This was Keynesianism on a scale we have never witnessed. By the time Obama left office in 2017, he had more than doubled the national debt, adding nearly $10 trillion to the total without much to show for it. The economy had not really grown. Low-wage private sector jobs were created, many of them, but not the kind of jobs needed to sustain a growing economy. This grand experiment in leftist progressive economics was a catastrophic failure. Obama's left progressive experimentation was only just the beginning. The Affordable Care Act, passed in 2010, was supposed to ensure all Americans without disrupting those who already had health insurance and doctors and preferred what they had. That promise turned out to be a fraud. So we come to what I call progressivism's second American failure. By the 2010 midterm elections, the Democrats lost in historic landslides at every level of government. State legislative chambers switched control. Republicans were back in control of the House, and many governorships were lost to the Republicans. Despite admitting his party was shellacked, Obama never moderated. a sign of a true believing ideologue. Conventional wisdom blamed anger over the passage of Obama's health care law for the losses. But voter anger over the ACA hardly explains losses at the state legislative level. The reasons lay deeper. Voters were losing confidence in the elected political leadership's ability to effectively address issues of concern. The 2010 midterm elections was a statement to the left progressives of the Democrat Party that voters didn't like the direction the country was heading. Those kinds of messages, however, are lost on elitist ideologues like Barack Obama, who zealously believe in their ideological prescriptions and think they know better. It would be one thing if those prescriptions had never been attempted, but they had been tried before, in the United States and elsewhere, and they simply did not work. Herein lies the problem with the true believing ideologues. No amount of failure ever deters them. They pursue their ideological goals with a religious fervor. Their failures are inevitably accompanied by alibis. One excellent example of this kind of religious fervor are the true believers in Marxism. Even through the fall of the USSR and the rest of the Eastern European Marxist states, true believers today claim those nations weren't truly Marxist at all. In fact, they believe they were never Marxist. This is denial because for the 7 decades the USSR was in existence, no Marxist ideologues anywhere were making such claims. Only when the USSR collapsed and more liberal, capitalistic, and open societies took their place did the ideologues make this dishonest claim. The progressive left in the United States is every bit as wedded to their idea of what society should look like as those heartbroken European Marxists trying to make sense out of a failed and corrupt ideology. The danger comes when those true believers have access to the levers of power. Now, I want to talk for a minute about what causes an ideology to succeed or fail. Ideologies, when they're used as organizing principles for societies, succeed or fail to the extent they are successful in interpreting basic human nature. Karl Marx failed to properly interpret the basic human condition. If we look at Marx for a minute, Marx's ambition was to explain all of reality with what he called scientific socialism. Now, if it was correct, his theories of nature could apply to human society too, but his theories were provably false. Essentially, Marx believed all of nature, including human society, was governed by 3 laws. They were the law of opposites, the law of negation, and the law of transformation. Now, I'm not going to get too buried in the weeds here on Marxist theory, but these laws were supposed to explain things like atomic motion, life cycles, propagation and proliferation, and just basic change. Marx believed his laws could be observed, as you would, in any scientific experiment, and applied to the behavior of atoms as well as humans in society. Rather than explain nature's laws, though, Marx's laws only presumed much of what it supposedly claimed to explain. Further, Marx's theories of motion, proliferation, and change were repudiated by observation. In other words, science itself proved scientific socialism to be false. Perhaps Marx's biggest mistake was believing human nature, if it evolves at all, can evolve quickly and sufficiently enough to even be observable. Adherents to Marx's philosophy have gone even one step further and believed human nature could be engineered. The attempts to do so in the 20th century led to the death of over 100 million people. When Chairman Mao in China started the Cultural Revolution, which was what that was designed to do, he murdered up to 70 million Chinese. Stalin, the same thing. Pol Pot, the same thing. These men were all trying to flush out those elements of society that didn't conform what they thought the socialist ideal was, because they thought that they can impose or engineer, if you will, the human condition. Progressivism suffers from the same kind of malady. Of course, they're not murdering people by the millions, but it does suffer from the same malady. It's just less virulent. Progressives believe in progress, naturally, but progressives never define progress. They only tell us it's inevitable, but they can't tell us the direction we're going. Progressives also seem to have an internal contradiction in their ideology. For example, I'll give you a really good example that goes into the real world. If humans are progressing, then we should expect social ills, for example, racism, to eventually wither away. If such were the case, then laws protecting certain racial minorities could one day be repealed. They wouldn't be necessary. Progressives find this idea anathema, repellent, and they argue that we must always have anti-racial discrimination laws because they say we will always have racial discrimination. But if humanity is truly progressing, racial discrimination must eventually come to an end. If progressives assume that racial discrimination will always be with us, then what is progressivism really all about? Progressivism seems to be rather subjective and political in this regard. Also, it is not quite true that human society is always progressing. During the Roman Empire, Roman homes had running water and indoor plumbing. After the Roman Empire fell in the late 5th century, Europe was without indoor plumbing for 1,000 years. That advance in technology was lost for an entire millennium. So it can hardly be said that human society makes continual forward progress. Like Marxism, progressive ideology also has a fatal flaw. Conservatism works because it's not an ideology in the truest sense of the word, and it comes closest to the pin in its interpretation of basic human nature. How does it do this, you might ask? Well, first of all, conservatism does not have a view of how the world ought to be. Other ideologies do. Conservatism understands the world as it is. This is very different from Marxism and progressivism, which have very specific views of what society should look like. Secondly, conservatism acknowledges that human beings will always act in their own self-interest, at least as a primary impulse. Our first impulse as human beings is not to act for the collective. That's what the utopian socialist or Marxist might say. People act for themselves. Finally, unlike Marxism and progressivism, conservatism does not hold that human nature is changeable. You could say that conservatives find that human nature is not very different than those of our ancestors who wrote on cave walls 10,000 years ago. Now, that doesn't mean conservatives, by the way, don't believe in evolution. It just means that evolutionary change is not so fully understood that we can observe it within a few hundred or even a few thousand years of human existence. Conservatism, though not perfect, works because it interprets the world it sees rather than trying to change the world. It organizes societies around man's basic nature to act in his self-interest rather than endeavor to change man's nature into something else. Economic and social relationships are organized around this reality. The results are largely harmonious, prosperous, and successful societies. Conservatism has its imperfections, of course, but when compared to the problems in Marxism and progressivism, they're minor. Now, where are we today? Everything I've pointed out to you here is known to leftist progressives, Marxists, communists, and others on the left. They know their ideas have failed, but they have not accepted failure. At the same time, we are well aware of the success of conservatism. But remember, To an ideologue, their ideology is like a religion. They are not going to abandon it. Instead, they won't retreat into a period of introspection and self-reflection. They're doing all they can to seize as much power through indoctrination and propaganda as possible. Their efforts become hysterical, they become radical, and in some cases they become violent because their only weapon against ideas that actually work for the betterment of society is fear and intimidation of those whose and their direct object is to silence the opposition. The great social experiment into left progressivist government has gone on for almost 100 years. Along the way, we have seen some good ideas, like weekends, paid vacation time for employees, the women's vote. But there have been bad ideas too, like prohibition. It is time for the progressives to move aside and let conservatives work instead of impeding them. They aren't likely to do this because they have learned from the success of Ronald Reagan's presidency and later Reagan Revolution in Congress that conservative solutions work, and they represent an existential threat to the progressive left agenda, which has been a dismal failure for many decades. So in some sense, their fanatical hysteria is understandable. They know that conservative policy implementation would very likely be successful and gain broad popular support. Their opposition to conservatism has a great deal to do with preventing their power and less with the good of society. Progressives are in both political parties. It's part of the reason so little ever seems to change in our national politics. The principles of the progressive left amounts to a counter-revolution to our founding. They are seeking to fundamentally transform the United States into a centrally planned authoritarian state controlled by a single political party. And that concludes my series on the evolution of the American counter-revolution. I hope you enjoyed it and given you some food for thought. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. This is Tony Codispoti for the Great Vocal Majority. Thanks very much for listening, everybody.